Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today for the call for the webinar. I think we do have a few more people joining shortly, so I'll be keeping an eye on the participants list that I've got up in front of me, and I'll be able to add them in as and when we come along. Just to introduce myself, my name is Peter Lane. I think I know some of the people here that are in the audience already, but for some that I don't, I will have a little section of the presentation that I'm going to go through where I'll introduce a bit more about me and my company, Cyro Cyber, but I won't let that detract from the main meat. The main bulk of the presentation is going to be all about our favourite topic, which is PCI DSS. In particular, this session's titled Scoping Smarter and Not Harder. My main intent from this was to try and deliver as much information as possible and really my brain to you as participants or as the audience, and the types of things that I come across when I'm conducting PCI DSS engagements or assessments of any way, shape or form. As I alluded to, I'll tell you a bit more about myself. I'm a managing cybersecurity consultant here at Cyro Cyber. I have been a consultant now for just shy of 5 years, and before that I had a relatively long career in the military. I really enjoy consultancy, mainly because I get to work with different clients on different assessments or different engagements, whether it's a couple of weeks at a time or a couple of months at a time. And I also quite like the different and unique challenges that I might come across, which is really nice. So each client environment that I enter or that I start an engagement with is absolutely unique, which is fascinating to me. And it means I get to learn more about their perspective and what their drivers are, whether that's achieving compliance against something like PCI DSS, or if it's just raising their overall security maturity. All of that is nice and different and unique in its own way. We've got a small slide here on Cyro Cyber, just for anyone who hasn't yet met Cyro Cyber as the organization. There's lots of shiny badges at the bottom, as you'd imagine. We have CE Plus and ISO 27001 and lots of abbreviations and acronyms that you'd expect from any cyber consultancy. But the bit I really want to draw on is in the middle there, our 4 core tenets. We deliver a wide variety of services to all of our customers. And actually what we really pride ourselves on is the ability to listen to a customer's needs and then go and not necessarily every time design a new service, but make sure that whatever it is we're delivering for you isn't just something off the shelf, it's something that is of benefit to a customer. And so we'll spend a lot of time and a really lot of time trying to understand your drivers and your perspective so that we can really ensure that we're pulling out a service that's fit for you. And in PCI DSS, that's really important, as we're going to come across, because it's so nuanced that actually, if we don't understand you and your environment very well, it's not going to be a good service delivered by us, and it's also not going to help you in the long term with your compliance. So that's our big driver. I'll just mention here quickly before I move on and start talking about the real bulk of the presentation, Cyro Cyber is a QSA company, and if you weren't already aware, you certainly will be by the end of this presentation. A QSA company is an organisation that's certified by the PCI Council to complete assessments against the PCI DSS, so the data security standard. So before we begin, I think I'll just introduce the presentation itself. It's almost the same as the presentation I delivered a few weeks ago for PCI London. And the reason we're delivering almost the same presentation is twofold. First of all, it was for anyone that wasn't able to make PCI London for any reason. The ability for me to be able to share some of our experiences is something I was really keen on and our marketing officer was really passionate about. And then secondly, actually, typical, such is life. I delivered a presentation on the 21st of January. On the 30th of January, the PCI Council released a couple of statements and clarifications that were in complete contradiction to one of my slides in particular, which is fantastic. And I'm sure there's things there about, you've got to stay on top of your game and make sure you have your finger on the pulse. But 9 days after I delivered a presentation, I wouldn't say the whole presentation was worthless, but one slide in particular, they completely changed and removed requirements that I spent a lot of time explaining. Which isn't a bad thing, because it means I then get to come again and talk again about PCI DSS, which obviously, as you imagine, I love. But also it means that we just get to keep discussing it and hopefully learn more as we go. So I included this slide at the time in PCI London because I think it's really important before I start discussing certain perspectives I've had or experiences that I've had when completing the assessments. It's really important that we sort of establish a few rules of the game for the presentation. First of all, this is all taken from my personal experience and also my other QSA peers. So the people in the industry that I speak to that are also QSAs that conduct the same assessments. They go to entities, whether that's a merchant or a service provider, they'll learn their environment, they'll then assess their environment, And when we discuss, not that we're all secretly WhatsApping each other or Teamsing each other in the background, but when we are talking about our shared experiences, we do all bring up the same points. And that's where the driver for this presentation came from. It was the idea that actually, as a merchant or a service provider, the people in the audience and people at PCI London, I don't imagine you get much of a avenue to try and start a discussion with assessors to understand what usually goes wrong or what usually goes right. And I thought it would be a really useful topic to cover. The last two bullet points are really important to me. First of all, the CDE, the cardholder data environment that you have as an entity or any customer has as an organization, is unique. There are no two the same. People can't just build and design one out of the box and pass it to you. You will have different people or different processes, and the technology might be similar, but it's unlikely to be the exact same. So I'll talk about experiences I've had or assessments I've completed during this presentation, but nothing will be able to be pulled out of it and applied to your environment verbatim. I'd always encourage you, wherever possible, first of all, ask your acquirer, like the last bullet point states, and then also engage the services of a QSA. Unfortunately, they come as a consultant, and so obviously there are resource limitations to that. But the plus side is that as a QSA, you have to go and pass a really hard exam every year, and you had to have attended a course to become a QSA, and you also needed to pass a load of prerequisites to be able to even go on to that course. And so there's a reason these people spend their days lovingly, I'm sure, tearing through the PCI DSS manual, but actually there's a reason they have the right perspective that the council makes sure is maintained every year. So if in doubt at all, ask your acquirer because they own your risk, and then engage a QSA if you feel it's appropriate. So we'll start to talk through some of the key topics. The way I've built the presentation is that we go through looking at the different payment channels in operation or commonly in operation by merchants and service providers. We'll go through the way in which I would conduct a assessment. And so the very first thing I would do is scoping. And for everyone that comes across PCI DSS, I think it's understood to varying degrees. Scoping is critical, almost the most important aspect of PCI DSS, apart from the fact that you have to protect the payment card data. That's the most important factor. But scoping really refers to my ability to understand your environment and understand how you store, process, or transmit cardholder data and why. And the reason that's important is because I come away from that scoping session and I have in my head how you need to comply, where, when, why, all those good things. And if I conduct an assessment against you and I've got the wrong idea, then first of all, I'm not assessing the correct part of your environment, meaning that you're not compliant. Even if I think you are, I've not covered the entirety of your CDE, of your scope. And so there'll be areas in there that mean that you're actually not fully compliant. And then secondly, actually, it means it's a waste of money, because if I am then completing an assessment that's inaccurate or it's against the inaccurate scope, well, then you're wasting your money because you're still not going to be compliant at the end of it. And then we have to revisit the entire process as and when you identify other things that do come within scope. So whenever I start working with a customer, whether that be a scoping exercise or if I'm going straight to the assessment phase, the first meeting I have is called a scoping meeting, because I need to make sure before I start putting pen to paper in any topic, I need to understand your payment environment. And for me, that would be your transaction volume. So how many transactions you've processed over the last 12 months. It would be what type, what form, and then the ways in which you collect payment information. Do you have retail sites, or do you process transactions on e-commerce environments in the websites? Or do you have a telephone contact center? Whatever that might be, that's the first thing I'll be talking to you about. And then we'll go into the nitty-gritty of technologies and processes that you might have in place. The reason for this first slide, I've got 2 bullet points up on the screen, that, as I alluded to, these are by far the 2 most common things that I'll be talking about. First of all, on a scoping call, but then also if I look back in the past couple of years of being a QSA, it's the most common things that have also gone wrong or been misunderstood. The first point being transaction volumes. And when we were in PCI London, I ran a little bit of a game. Unfortunately, because it's a webinar, I can't be quite as interactive with you. But in PCI London, we did lots of moving around, lots of interaction, audience participation. And I asked the audience, if I was a merchant and I was processing 9 million transactions per year, what level of a merchant would I be termed as? And the reason this is important is because it has knock-on impacts or effects as to how you would then go and comply. And people in the audience said 9 million transactions would be a level 1. And I said, okay, fantastic, that's good. And in simple maths, because my brain is quite simple, if 5 million were Visa and 5 million were MasterCard, and you have that information, what level would I be? And again, they said level 1, and unfortunately it's not completely accurate. And this is a common misconception in PCI DSS. People hear 6 million, it's easier to say in round figures and in one bullet point, 6 million level 1, but it's not actually true. The payment brands themselves that you can see on the screen, the 6 there, they are the key payment brands for the PCI Council and for PCI DSS, and they set their own merchant volumes. And so whilst everyone just believes 6 million is level 1, in actual fact, Visa has their own number and MasterCard has their own number, and those numbers for both of them are 6 million. But if you're processing 5 million of one and 4 of the other, that doesn't mean that you add them together and you become a level 1. It sounds like a really small point to have to harp on about to bring at the beginning of this hopefully amazing presentation. But the reason I harp on about it is because if you do become a level 1, you then have to go and complete a report on compliance, which is a really big undertaking. That means someone like me, a QSA, would come into your environment or come and speak to you in your organization, and it would be a test. I can't help you, I can't work with you during the process. I come in, I have the questions, I ask the questions. And also, there's a lot of questions, several hundred pages of questions that I'll be asking you to provide evidence for or discuss. And even if some of them aren't applicable, I then have to justify whether they're not applicable. And put quite bluntly, it's an expensive undertaking because you're then paying for a QSA to complete that against you. And if you've done that thinking you're a level 1 when actually you're not a level 1 and you could have completed a different form of assessment, I'm sure most entities that I've worked with would much rather go down that other route. Not just because they'd like to save money, but also because it's a huge amount of effort to go to for something that you wouldn't need to, unless your acquirer has asked you to separately. The second point there, eligibility criteria. In my opinion, probably the most often overlooked aspect, certainly when I'm speaking to small and medium-sized organizations. These are a set of bullet points at the beginning of all SAQs, which is a self-assessment questionnaire. So if you're not a level 1 completing a report on compliance, you have the option to complete or be assessed against a self-assessment questionnaire. And they've written these in a really clever way. There's a format that basically pulls out the key requirements that they think are applicable to certain payment environments. So if you process transactions on websites only, e-commerce, and you outsource all those aspects to validated parties, and there's lots of other criteria that you'd fall under, but the chances are you might be able to complete an SAQA, which is really good. And if you're a retail merchant using a good payment machine, you could do an SAQ BIP like the one you see. But to know if you're able to fill in that form, or if an assessor can assess you against that form, this set of bullet points are the things that I would go to. And when I do complete assessments and I work with merchants and service providers and I will start the engagement, and they say we're an SAQA, we do e-commerce, the very first thing I do as an assessor is pull up this set of bullet points. And you have to meet every single one of these bullet points. If one of them is not being met by you as the entity, I can't use that form. And it's really important because you would think to yourself, I'm using a QSA for this amount of days, or I'm going to complete this form because I know I meet that eligibility criteria. And if you don't, and this does have some serious consequences, you then need to use a much bigger form. You need to answer a lot more detailed questions and provide a greater amount of evidence. And if you are using a QSA, it means more days and more time that you're paying for to bring them in and their expertise. So for me, these two things are absolutely critical. We then move on to the first of the 3 payment channels that I've drawn out for the slides and for this presentation. And I start with e-commerce. It's not my favorite. It's certainly the easiest, I think, to assess, and it's the easiest to be assessed against as an entity. But it still has its own drawbacks and its own things that are commonly misunderstood. And the first I'll say is the iframe. So generally speaking, and again, this is where it's not exact for every single environment, but generally speaking, most people I come across and most entities I assess, if they're using e-commerce, then they tend to use an iframe from a payment service provider or some form of redirect technology. And that's brilliant. That's great. It helps you meet that SAQA eligibility, which means that you have a very small group of questions that you'll need to meet and be assessed against, which is fantastic. But the first thing I'll do is ask you to show me the iframe or show me evidence that there is an iframe being hung on your web page and that the customer is inputting their data to a payment service provider or being redirected to that payment service provider. And it's really common for the entities not to know how to do that. And there's nothing, actually, I'm not going to say it's because I'm such a good guy, but there's nothing that says that I have to show you how to or help you do that. I could, and other assessors I know do, just sit and wait for you to understand how to pull up an iframe. But it is your obligation to be able to do that. And it's not just the ability to show me that you have an iframe hung on the web page. What's really important here is that you understand there is an iframe, and that you understand how to check there is, because there's so many other requirements that come in with PCI DSS where you need to maintain a good understanding of the scripts running on each page that processes payments, that you need to, for your own security and your own understanding, be able to do this. And I've got an example up on the screen there of where an iframe is being used to redirect to a payment service provider. And it would be as simple as viewing the page or viewing the source code and then looking through to see the iframe, in this case, redirecting to Adyen. The second point is ASV scans, a really important point that's become even more important with the introduction of version 4 of PCI DSS. And I think it's going to be a bone of contention over the next 12 months, certainly. In 2025, I think it's going to be a big talking point. In version 3.2.1, the outdated version of PCI DSS, ASV scans weren't required if you were transmitting or using an e-commerce payment channel. However, it's changed now for version 4, and you do need ASV scans. An ASV scan is an approved scanning vendor. There is a list that you can find on the PCI Council's site of people that are allowed to provide these scans for you. And they're very strict. There's a program guide on exactly what has to be included in the scan and the format and the methods and so on and so forth. And as a QSA, when I come in and say, can I please see your 4 annual, which is once every quarter, can I see your 4 ASV scans? I would need to see each 4. And if any have findings on there that are high or critical, I'd need to see then the rescan to prove that they've been remediated. And that's something I would ask you for. If I enter an environment or I start working with a client and in the next year I say, can you show me your scans, and there hasn't been any, it's going to be very difficult not to let them know they're not compliant and then going on to some form of next step to say that you're not compliant. And I think it's going to be a really big shock to a lot of people. And the reason the last bullet point just I drew out is the reason why ASV scans are so important. And just before PCI London, actually the day before, there was a company in America that announced how their payment card details of their customers had been breached. And the method and the target and the avenue of exploitation was a vulnerability on a website that, had the website had been receiving ASV scans, it had been identified. And actually it was open for several months, but actually it could have been closed down. And the purpose really is to confirm the site's not susceptible to attacks from scripts that could affect the merchant's e-commerce system. And that's something that I think most merchants I've spoken with, haven't been prepared for, or didn't really see the importance. They believe their payment service provider should be the ones completing these scans, but actually it's also your page that's hanging that iframe, so it's your page that then also needs a scan to be completed. Moving on to MOTO, or mail order, telephone order. The laughter in the room when I started talking about mail order at PCI London was kind of then faced towards me as I explained that mail order, for anyone that isn't aware, is the old school system of being able to write down your cardholder details and sending them using Royal Mail through the post to a processor or a merchant or a service provider. And for me, I just thought, it's incredible. I can't imagine anyone using this. But actually, on the train that day, I saw in the magazine I was reading a mail order slip. And I think I've seen 3 since. It's just because I haven't been looking for them that I haven't seen them. So clearly something that is still in operation. But as a QSA, I've not had to assess many environments against this. And so it's not one that I've drawn out when I looked at the common things I've come across. Telephone order, on the other hand, absolutely. And I've got a really good example. In the last 12 months, I've completed an assessment against a university. And they're really big, and their campus has a plethora of different payment channels in operation. And where telephone order is concerned, they have a gym that is receiving telephone calls through their normal landline that comes in, and the person whilst on the phone might be processing a booking for a squash court or something along those lines, and they then tap in the cardholder details to secure the booking into a payment card machine. That's one channel. And then separately from that, in their main, what I'd call a headquarters, in their main building, they have a finance department who might take payment for tuition fees, and they'll do that using Teams on their laptops. And they have a headset, and then they load up a virtual terminal for Barclaycard in the screen next to them, and they then type the details into there. And unfortunately, where telephone order is concerned, it's such a specific and really detailed payment channel that both of those explanations I just gave and both those examples would be termed not meeting the defined means of the standard. So I wouldn't be able to reduce the scope for the entity in any way, shape or form and use an SAQ or something smaller to be able to say, okay, great, you are reducing the scope of your payment environment. Unfortunately, in both those explanations and those examples, the cardholder details are transiting the network, and it brings the entirety of the university network into scope. And that's where telephone order is concerned. My first port of call as an assessor which is openly available to everyone, including merchants, service providers, anyone who has the internet can go onto the PCI Council's website and they can download that guidance that you can see on the screen there. And this is the first thing whenever I'm on a pre-sales call, I always say to people, if you do use a telephone in any way or a call environment, I would look at this document to make sure, because it explains session-based controllers, public branch exchanges, all sorts of really technical details that are important when processing payments through any telephone means. Yes. And then the last payment channel that I'll move on to is bricks and mortar. Easily my favorite, because not only do I get to do this bit of role playing with everyone on the call, or you'll see me essentially act it out both parts myself, but also it's the one in which I get to go around lots of nice, pretty places and travel the world or travel Britain, visiting watch shops or food retailers or anything else where they might be processing payments in retail environments. And I have the same conversation almost every single time. Very rarely do I meet an entity that is using an accredited certified P2P solution. Most commonly, I'll work with an entity where they believe they are using a P2P solution, and actually through several phone calls and emails, we then find out it's not. It turns out it is actually a normal solution that can be, encrypting the payment information and sending it to the payment service provider. And so the conversation goes a little bit like, I use P2P. As an assessor, I then ask to see the proof. And the proof I would ask for is the reference number for the solution. And then I would ask to see the P2P implementation manual, which is this nice shiny booklet that the provider would give you with the P2P solution. And on both cases, if you're not running a P2P solution, you'd probably turn around and say, I don't know what either of those are. And as an assessor, I'd then recommend that you contact the people who provided you with the payment devices. And most likely you'll find out it's not a P2P solution. And the difference is that a solution has been verified and certified by the PCI Council, and it then not guarantees, but it certifies that your payment information is encrypted from the point of capture all the way through to being processed by the payment service provider. A device that you have in a retail location that isn't a part of a P2P solution could still be encrypting the payment information, but it's not been certified. It's not gone through that rigorous testing. And there's other parts of that process that are then included in that rigorous testing to make it a solution. If nothing else, I think as I worked out with one of my customers, you would know if it was a P2P solution because the sheer price of a solution alone compared to a normal, a card machine being used in your stores, I think you would probably know about it. The knock-on effect is if I have worked with entities where you believe you're going to be able to answer an SAQ P2PE, which is a very small amount of questions that I have to ask and evidence I have to look at. If through that process we identify that you're not, and actually you're using a normal cardholder solution, it then changes what I have to ask. I then have 88 questions that I need to go on to ask you about. And some of these questions you might not be prepared for. And that's why the eligibility criteria is so important that we'll go on to discuss further. Because if you're expecting for me to come along and just look at your devices and check your store staff are keeping it safe, that's one thing. But if I then start asking you about segmentation testing and start asking about vulnerability scanning in case you've got external IPs, so on and so forth, I think there's a lot of things there that could trip you up in an assessment. And in my experience, when I work with customers, they might be merchants or service providers. If they've not been prepared for that, the chances are they're not going to be passing their compliance for that year, because if you've not known you had to do segmentation testing, it's not something you can retrospectively do. And the knock-on effect then comes down to the eligibility criteria as well. And this is something very common for SAQ BIP. This is where you might be using a payment device in your showrooms or retail sites, whatever it might be. And you might think you meet this SAQ BIP criteria, which again has quite a lot of questions, has 88, I believe. And I come along and I look through that eligibility criteria and say, okay, well, is the device connected to anything? And the answer might be yes, the printer, the till, the EPOS solution, or the laptop, or, well, actually, as you can see from that eligibility criteria that I've drawn out there, it clearly states in that SAQ, it cannot be connected. It has to be standalone. And so if I do arrive to a retail location and it's plugged into a laptop because that's something they're choosing to do, I then can't even use that SAQ. I have to go onto an SAQ-D, which is the entire standard. It's massive. It's a really big undertaking. It's a lot of effort. And if you are using a QSA to complete your assessment, it's then a lot of cost to have them go through that entire form. So again, just something to be watch out for. If you do have retail locations and you're using devices, have a look through those SAQs and understand if you're using a P2P solution. And the last bullet point is site visits. This is something that was prevalent over the last 2 years in particular, where I've started to work with a customer, started an engagement and found out during a really open and frank discussion about how they complied the previous year with a different company, and they might say, well, they didn't bother with site visits. Or maybe my organization and other organizations I've worked for have said, we need this many days and we intend to visit your sites. And they say, well, why? I don't want you to. And I just thought I'd maybe clear the air and have a point on here. So there is nothing in the PCI Council or in the PCI DSS in the standard that would say, as an assessor, as a QSA, I have to go into one of your retail locations. That's absolutely fair. I don't have to, unless you're completing a report on compliance where it would say, where did the assessor go and how many days did they spend there and what did they do? I have to do it for a ROC. But if you're doing an SAQ of any form, I don't have to go to visit any of your retail sites. But there is an area in there, 9.5, where I'm meant to be understanding how you protect those payment devices. And so if you're asking me to assess you against that standard and against that question in particular, if I'm not able to go to the retail locations and I can't ask those questions, then I can't guarantee or certify or assess that they're being met. And so what you would probably find is that if an assessor like me said, I'd like to go to some of your retail locations and you said, I don't want you to, absolutely fine. But in that bottom column of the SAQ where the QSA would normally countersign and say, don't worry, guys, they're doing it all really safely. Everything's fantastic. Sorry, it's a bit informal, but essentially everything is meeting the standards. What I would then put in is a really strong sentence to say the entirety of 9.5 could not be assessed because the merchant or the service provider didn't want us to go on site for any reason to any of the retail locations. So there'd be a really strong justification in there to protect us as a QSA company from anything essentially going wrong, and then my company being held responsible later down the line. So where possible, I wouldn't say make sure you do on-site visits at all times. Sometimes your acquirer will ask you to. Sometimes as a level 1 merchant or service provider, you'll have to because it's in the report and compliance. And actually, I'd maybe take a risk-based approach and look at the amount of locations you have and then talk to the QSA and say, I only have 20. Do you have to visit so many of them, or can you just visit one to sample? Or, I have 200 of them. Let's come up with a good number that means I'm not paying over the odds and needing you to go around the country doing it. But also I've got that assurance that each of my retail locations are doing the activity that they're meant to and that I've asked them to do. So work with the QSA on this one. That is the final payment channel. The last couple of points there I've left on the slide for just generic points that are things I've come across. Third-party service providers, definitely a key one there, where an entity won't be logging each third party they're using and which requirements they then need to meet with regards to PCI DSS. And these are all points within the standard that are really important. I'd say policies and processes, just as a single bullet point, update them every year. Have a look, and if anything changes dramatically in your environment, update them again. Because as an assessor, if I ask to see them and they're several years out of date, it really doesn't bode a lot in terms of or build confidence. Segment your environment. If you do use segmentation of any kind, logical or physical, and it needs to have a segmentation test completed by a service. Cyro Cyber do this. We have a penetration testing capability that can do segmentation testing as well, but have a dedicated test performed, or make sure it's a note or a deliverable on your pen test. And then the last point is just about the new payment brand non-compliance fines that have come in. Not directly relevant to PCI DSS as an assessor's point of view, but I encourage every merchant and service provider to have a look if you're looking forward to your assessment this year. The certain payment brands like Visa and MasterCard have now introduced fines. So if the assessor deems you to be not compliant, they will now start issuing you, if that report is validated and sent through to your acquirer, they'll start issuing fines each month. And it's something you can readily search for on the internet and find the results. And that is all the points for me. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I'll just end, sorry, I don't want to go over time because I know everyone's got meetings, but I'll just end by saying, please feel free to get in touch for any reason, whether that's Teams or Outlook, or with me directly on LinkedIn as well. I love people asking me random PCI questions or any type of compliance. Yeah, please feel free to reach out to the team at Cyro Cyber, and we'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for joining today.